What approach do you take within the nature-nurture debate on language acquisition?
Well, this is an interesting question. So there are basically two approaches to language acquisition. The nature debate suggests that there's an innate basis to language and that you're born pre-wired with some kind of linguistic knowledge that at least guides the process of acquiring the language. And then the alternative approach, the nurture approach, doesn't suggest that children are born with this kind of knowledge pre-wired, but instead they learn by experience. So they learn through having exposure to language in the same way that you would learn maths or learn to tie your shoelaces. And within that debate, my approach tends to be within the kind of nativist side. So I think that there is an innate basis to language. It's an open question as to how much of language is innate, and actually I think that ultimately what we're talking about here is two ends of a continuum, and the actual kind of answer, to the extent that you can have an answer to this question, is going to lie somewhere between nature and nurture and not be at the poles, but a combination of these two things.
And why do you take this view on the debate?
I think there's lots of evidence to support the idea that we have some innate basis for language. So what we do when we learn language is actually really very impressive. So within the first 3 or 4 years of life, you learn something that's much more complicated than most of the maths that you ever learn, significantly more complicated than learning to tie your shoelaces, and yet you have to put lots of effort in and practice those things a lot to get to the stage of being adult-like, of having mastered them. Language doesn't seem to be like that. You don't seem to have to put much effort in to be able to learn it. So it doesn't seem to be a process of learning in the same way that you learn maths and chemistry. It doesn't seem to be this kind of conscious process. And also I think that it's difficult to see how you could go about learning it unless you want to claim that children have really amazing abilities at things like identifying patterns. So if you think about the kind of thing that you might have done in school, where you have a number sequence, for instance, and it asks you to identify the next 3 numbers in the sequence, that's quite challenging for most people anyway, just to be able to sit and look at the pattern and identify what the pattern is there. To be able to do that with language, to be able to learn language, children would need to have those kind of pattern finding abilities when they're 2, 3 and 4 years old, because they need to be able to extract these kind of regularities in the input that they receive in order to then be able to work out what the rules are and to understand the rules and to be able to use those rules themselves when they're using language productively. It's even more complicated than just seeing the pattern for children, though, because they don't get the sequence of numbers presented one after the other. So they would have to monitor the input over a period of time, and it might be that today they'll hear a couple of sentences which are like the first 2 numbers in your sequence, and then next week they might hear the next 3 numbers in the sequence, but nobody will actually tell them that this is part of the sequence. So not only do they have to notice the patterns, but they have to notice the right instances of the data that gives them those patterns in the first place over a long period of time. And I think trying to see how you could ever manage and cope with that kind of information makes this a really challenging problem. The fact that children acquire language very quickly and do so with no explicit teaching, nobody tells them what's right and wrong, leads you towards this view that actually there must be something guiding this. There must be some process that makes it as apparently effortless as it seems to be.
And do you feel that both nature and nurture has a role to play in language acquisition?
Undoubtedly. I mean, I think people often mistake the nativist point of view. So they often think that what nativists are claiming is that language is completely innate. And clearly, it's unreasonable to think that you're born knowing every possible language perfectly worked out, and you just have this rule book in your head and that's how you speak. The input is important even for nativists. So at a basic level, things like the words that you use, you're not born knowing the words of English. If you're going to be an English speaker, you have to learn those. So there's an element of learning even for nativists. And I think that the actual answer to where language comes from is on a continuum between the true nativist view that language is completely innate, through to the non-nativist view that language is learned. And actually what we need to work out is which aspects of language have an innate basis and which aspects are things that can be learnt from the input and that plausibly are learnt from the input. So what we'll end up with is somewhere in the middle of this continuum rather than being at the extremes.